So Ara Katz, you are the co-founder, co-CEO of Seed. And I'm just super excited to dive into this. You have a lot going on. Mm-hmm. And I think what we'll focus on first is, how you built the company and why, because it's a really interesting story. Then we'll get into what and why gut biome is so important. And then we'll really hit it with vaginal biome, mm-hmm. and which will be really interesting and exciting. And I think a lot of people who listen to this will really be appreciative of not only learning about it, maybe for the first time, or getting to know more, and then understanding what Seed is doing in relation to that. So let's just start with, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. It's so much more fun in person. Yes. And so what was the impetus? Why did you start Seed? And it's been another one of your babies and it's grown. So just sort of jump into that.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's interesting. The name Seed mm-hmm. actually comes from the biological term seeding, which is the process by which we're all exposed as infants to the foundational microbes that form our microbiomes and eventually, of course, inform our GI health, our immune health, and so many other aspects of our health.
Will you just stop for 1 second?
Yes.
And if you had to give a one-sentence definition of what microbiome
Absolutely.
is?
I was just about to do that.
Yes,
I was going
to
to
say,
before
please.
We start, let's first understand that. The microbiome is the community of microbes that live in and on us. A lot of people think that the microbiome is just because it's been kind of conflated with just gut health. They think it's just the gut microbiome. Mm-hmm. And that is the largest and most diverse and most dense microbiome of the body. So there's a good reason why it's been conflated. It's also where the science kind of started. But the microbiome actually is the community and ecology of microbes that live all in and on us. And that's not just the gut microbiome. That includes the skin microbiome. That includes the oral microbiome, which is the second most diverse microbiome and ecology of the body. Mm-hmm. That includes the optical microbiome, the nasal microbiome. It includes also the axial microbiome, under our armpits. Mm-hmm. Your belly button has its own ecology. And then, of course, we'll talk about today other really critical microbiomes like the vaginal microbiome. Mm-hmm. So there's not just this overarching microbiome, which are all the microbes, and that includes mostly bacteria, mm-hmm. but also includes phages and viruses and fungi. And those exist and co-evolved over many, 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 many years to serve very varying biological functions depending on where they live on the body and what organ system and areas of health that they touch. The gut, of course, as I said, most people think microbiome, they think gut.
Right.
And that is because it is kind of the central switchboard. It's the most dense and it has the most connectivity to the vast amount of biological functions and organ systems of the body. Okay. So people may have heard of the gut-brain axis, for example. Mm-hmm. There's the gut-liver axis. There's the gut-lung axis. There's the gut-vaginal axis. Mm-hmm. And so it also has these kind of axes mm-hmm. into these other areas as well, which is why, again, people think microbiome and they think gut. And because it's connected to so many things, but actually microbiome is much broader, which is a good segue back to answering your question. When we started Seed, I actually started Seed when I was pregnant. And I think, I've been a lifelong, I think you and I connected over mm-hmm. this when we first met, which is, taking a quick time travel back to high school. My mom died of pancreatic mm-hmm. cancer when I was really young. And that was really my first introduction to reading scientific papers and learning about clinical research and clinical trials. And that kicked off a very lifelong journey for me, which was deeply understanding biology and health, simply to make better choices. But also, for whatever reason, I got nerdy enough that people started to ask me questions.
Yeah.
And it wasn't because I was dispensing medical advice. It was simply that I was good at research mm-hmm. and synthesis, mm-hmm. And then communicating it. And mm-hmm. in some cases, connecting dots to different scientists or doctors. I think that over time, and I think especially when you see someone who's dying at a very early age, you also realize that no matter how many answers science has, you realize that there's always more to learn and there's really big missing links. It's partially why so many people turn to alternative and integrative and functional medicine, and even other modalities of medicine especially when you get really sick, because traditional medicine sometimes doesn't have all the answers. And so my whole life, I definitely felt that there was a missing piece. And I didn't know if it was even coming from the functional and integrative world as much as I was so fascinated why there was this mass exodus and interest in that. And I think that's because people are searching for answers because we live in a moment where the amount of disease and conditions we experience is unprecedented. We've never been this sick before in all of human history. Never had this many chemicals circulating in our food systems and environment. We've never been exposed to this many disruptors to our health. And so for me, and I think especially when you get pregnant, I had a miscarriage and then I got pregnant shortly after that. And the microbiome had already started to come onto my periphery and started to really understand and hear more about it. But when I was pregnant, I met my co-founder, and I think he had he had been tracking the microbiome since 2006. There were these kind of like seminal and pivotal mouse studies that happen where you took like a lean mouse's microbiome, put it in an obese mouse, lean mouse. The lean mouse got obese, the obese mouse got lean. Similar thing happened with like two mice. You would transplant their microbiomes. All of a sudden, one mouse started to exhibit signs of much younger mouse, like beautiful, lush fur. And, science we're very like vain as a human species. And so all of a sudden you're like, whoa, we can lose weight and look younger. This area of science must be, we gotta like pay attention to
We really need to like dig into this.
But actually it really did show how the gut, like and how the microbiome was like that. Those were two kind of shots heard in the dark, so to speak, that heard around the world. And he had been tracking it since that time. And he and I both, I think, saw this beautiful white space, which was that, and I was pregnant. So like, the world gives you plenty of unsolicited advice that to me, and coming as somebody who had always grounded myself in science, but had a very wide aperture as to what I think was so interesting in the way people are searching for health solutions, the microbiome to me was kind of this almost like messianic, this like aha moment, right? It was like, wow, for all of medicine and until now, and if you think about the microbiome, when I defined it, I also missed out on saying it constitutes almost 50% of the cells in our body.
Wow. So
if you just think about the idea that we are we are half human, really. And then you think about, wow, they also, these the otherlings, these microbes, actually I can't live without, and they actually can't live without me. And when you start to think, but all of medicine and everything that we've been taught until now was only looking at 50% of us. And so you start to say, and again, like, they express about 100 times the amount of genes that our human cells do in our bodies. And there's crazy stats, and sometimes they get a little sensationalized, but all to say that it is a invisible world that until we had the technology that came from the Human Genome Project to actually understand and see them, we couldn't actually, first we needed to see them, then we needed to see them at a very high resolution. We needed to see their genes because we couldn't really understand what they did. And the more that like my co-founder was tracking the field, the more that I was pregnant and really thinking about like deeply about, first of all, as part of my life story, like where do I want to make the biggest impact? What do I know how to do? Is build, I've been around frontier tech. I've been around, like, I know how to like build companies around these things, but obviously I'm not a scientist. My co-founder fills that gap, but we both, I think, from different perspectives, him from a biology perspective and health perspective, saw that the microbiome was really this like 0 to 1. And for me, it was this like missing link. It was the missing part of the picture. And very early on, even though we started in gut microbiome, again, that's where the science started, we really began Seed with this vision to realize the potential of this invisible world for human health. And what that meant was becoming this translational science company that could take the breakthrough science and research that was happening, almost always relegated to therapeutics. But we had this vision that in microbiome, very unlike the genome, like the genome's kind of fixed. I mean, in the future, we'll kind of CRISPR some things we don't like out of ourselves. But for the most part, the genome's fixed. We don't go to Whole Foods and I want to buy something for my genome.
Right.
The microbiome is amazing because it is this dynamic and ever-changing environment in our body that is so receptive to intervention, whether it's changes in lifestyle, diet, sleep, hydration, stress, exercise, that can be shaped. And that's a beautiful, beautiful lever of health that we never had before. And so for us, it was how could we also translate this extraordinary science into life-changing innovations in consumer health? And really, not just that, of course, create a brand around that uses the microbiome as a lens through which we can live and make great choices every day. And I think that to me was like I can do this for the rest of my life because, by the time we finish this podcast, there'll be 20 new papers that came out on the microbiome in some new area or field. Maybe it's in cancer, maybe it's in chemo, maybe it's in skin, whatever that looks like. It's a field that is moving so quickly because we're now starting to connect the dots of actually what we saw back when we started Seed, which was the potential it really has for such extraordinary human health impact. And so, and environmental, we do a lot of environmental work too. So really looking at microbes also we have a probiotic for honeybees too, and coral reefs. So, we think about this as like a beautiful, microbiome is also this like beautiful way when you think about community and all the things the world needs right now. We need to think in much more sustainable frameworks. And so microbiome is this beautiful framework for thinking about systems and how everything's connected in ways that I think traditional medicine and many aspects of science really ended up being developed in a much more siloed ways that didn't appreciate some of the connectivity.
In addition to the way that science sort of like cuts up your body.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
You see a specialist who's just a specialist in one part of your body or a surgeon who thinks immediately you have to have surgery, whatever it is. And particularly, where my background is particularly with women. And so it's been such a breakthrough and an eye-opener for us to see that, no, like it's your whole body and everything affects each other and different parts of your body are talking and working together. And if you don't address the whole body, you're missing you're missing the big picture and you're inevitably going to miss the small things that are the ones, causing the changes or causing the disruption in your body.
And it goes beyond medicine. You just have to walk into a grocery store or a Target and know that the whole world has disembodied us.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you were really having a skin health aisle, you'd have blueberries next to moisturizer, right? Like we organize our world in a very disembodied way, right? Like we think about like even the skin, we think about face versus body. Then we think about, food is in one area, but then like supplements and vitamins are, and of course, like it's very hard. The world is organized in a very capitalistic way around like planograms, which is what retailers call the way they lay out a store.
Right.
And so we organize our life and then make decisions for our health from incredibly siloed frameworks, which I think the microbiome, I like to say the microbiome is really disrupting kind of the planogram of the future because you really need to start seeing this connectivity and more so than the connectivity, it's also looking at the root causes of things and versus like we're a very symptom-based and reactive culture in general. And I think the ability to really look at some of the underlying reasons, and a lot of times it has to do with, and we know this is highly correlated with the diseases that are growing at the highest rates, which is there's usually a microbiome dysbiosis, or dysbiosis is kind of a fancy word for just saying out of balance in the microbiome in some capacity that leads to many of the conditions and is highly correlated with so many of the conditions that truthfully didn't even exist before 1960.
Yeah.
That we deal with today that are chronic.
Yeah.
And we're in a moment where we die of things that are not contagious, which has never before happened in history.
Yeah. And diagnosing people with things that you'd never heard of before, especially young people.
Yes.
That sort of
I think there was like
mind.
crazy the cancer study that came out maybe a month or so ago that said cancer's happening at younger and younger ages now.
Yeah. People like us are asking the question, like why? But sort of the bigger, organizations or certainly at the government level aren't. Like you said, it's just reactionary. And how do we treat this? And how do we make them better? As opposed to why is that? Why do girls get their periods so much earlier than they ever did? And on and on and on. So if you're looking at starting with the gut and one of the things I find so fascinating about microbiome in general, and specifically in the gut, is what you talked about earlier, which is how you can actually make significant change. And it's really in your control. And to me, that's preventative, which is the key to life. So will you just dive into that a little bit more?
Yeah. And I want to be careful to not be so sensational to say if someone's listening, they have like really chronic conditions.
Yeah,
like,
of course.
Of course there's realities that like the human part of us is a big part too.
Yeah.
But for the most part, the microbiome, as I said, is kind of this ever-changing dynamic ecology that even when you travel, your microbiome can change. They look at immigrant populations. I think there was a really big study that was done a number of years ago that looked at Chinese immigrants in the United States. I think they were in Chicago or somewhere in the Midwest. Within 30 days of being in the United States, their microbiomes had completely changed. And so, it's really interesting how malleable this environment is. And I think there's a few key levers. They're not going to blow your mind, right? Because they're not new levers, but there's things that you can do. And then I'd say there's things that you can avoid once you understand how they impact the microbiome. So let's just start with antibiotics. So there's 211 million prescriptions of antibiotics written in the United States. Over half of them are for things that are of non-bacterial origin, which means that they're being taken either prophylactically, which by the way, in certain cases like surgeries, and please don't hear that I'm not an anti-antibiotics person. Yeah. I'm an anti-indiscriminate use of antibiotics person. And by the way, this is what Bill Gates says is the greatest threat to humanity, right? Yeah. Because our overuse is leading to antibiotic resistance, which means they just don't work anymore. Yeah. And when we get into vaginal health, we can talk about that. But very importantly, the broad spectrum antibiotics are nuclear bombs in your gut. So what's happening is that you have millions and millions and millions of people, sometimes on multiple cycles of antibiotics, but also not doing any of the things from an environmental and lifestyle perspective that could restore or repopulate or regenerate the microbiome back to like baseline functioning or stasis, right? And so I'd say as a more prescriptive way of saying that, don't take Cipro every time you feel a sneeze. Come on. Like there really is. And I know that this is more, you'd be surprised, even though I sometimes think people, and I think people are being more mindful of it with kids and children now too, and especially with kids, right? Because up till 5 years old, between 3 and 5 years old, that's when the microbiome's developing. That is like very similar, like you have a critical window for language learning. 0 to 5 is this critical window of development for kids. And there's a lot of overuse of antibiotics in children. It's like the first thing you kind of go to when you, and understandably, you really care, you want to, and sometimes again, they're needed. It's not so much about not using them when they're needed, it's about what else can you do. So the first is just being very mindful when you're going to take antibiotics and deeply understanding some of the downstream impact that they have. And if you are going to take them, just being very thoughtful about some of the next things that I'm going to talk about. The second is diet. We're now at a point from a scientific perspective in microbiome. And again, none of the prescriptive things I'll say will blow your mind because of course, like telling people to eat plants is nothing new. Right. But if it helps to frame it through this perspective of plant fibers and compounds from a diverse array of plants in a diet is critical because that is the food source that microbes need, good microbes need to either both flourish as well as to use them to biotransform some of those compounds from food into very important metabolites for our health. Sometimes those metabolites are signaling to our brain. Some of those plant fibers are doing everything from just supporting the healthy signaling of like when we know we're satiated, right? If you think about the Ozempic and how some of those mechanisms work. I mean, gut-brain axis is a critical part of just simply knowing when you're satiated, like I should just not eat anymore. So when that Wi-Fi signal is disrupted, you have a lot of people who are eating too much. And of course, we have metabolic syndrome and obesity and all these issues that kind of come not just from that, but partially. And so food and plants and a diversity of plants, and actually one of the things that came out of the American Gut Project, which was one of the bigger, scientific community science projects looking at big data set of microbiome, is that eating of a diversity, they suggest at least 30 different types of plant sources in a given week because I think a lot of us who eat healthy tend to eat the same thing every day, but actually the diversity of plants is very, very important. And of course, honestly, the easiest, both in terms of the diversity of different plant fibers, as well as some of the other phytonutrients and other compounds that exist in plants are critical for your microbiome to function healthily. It's kind of like a help them help you. So idea with food.
So what would be your top 10 plants?
So now it comes down to like, what are the sources of fiber that are awesome? So I think there's, when you think about cruciferous vegetables, or you think about there's the broccolis and the Brussels sprouts and the cauliflowers, those are extraordinary sources of like fibers, inclusive, by the way, of the stalks. I always tell people, like, eat the stalks. Extraordinary source of fiber.
We get in such a fight in our house about the stalks and the tops, which is really funny.
Yeah. That is funny.
I'm like, eat the whole thing,
Eat the whole thing. Evolution has done beautiful things for plants. There's a reason the stalk exists, and there's a reason the florets exist. So I think you have like those really like fibrous, dense foods, like, again, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, even artichokes, for example. All of these have been really demonstrated to have compounds that have what are called a prebiotic effect, or prebiotic fibers that really feed, and again, do what I said in terms of how they help your microbes. Polyphenols, for example, are another really important compound. Those are found in like dark berries. So really thinking about like blueberries, again, nothing mind-blowing. You can talk to any longevity person and person who cares about antioxidants, like, to talk about blueberries. But I personally think wild blueberries, like especially even just the frozen ones, are extraordinary, incredibly nutrient dense, but also a great source of nutrients for your microbes. And polyphenols are interesting because, for example, in pomegranate, I think pomegranate's like the fruit of the polyphenols of all polyphenols, and it's actually the source for the prebiotic that's in our adult product. But I think pomegranate, blueberries, blackberries, these darker, nutrient dense like fruits and berries specifically are extraordinary sources of some of these compounds. Polyphenols, as just to use an example, like in pomegranate, microbes will transform that into a compound that you're starting to hear a lot more about in the longevity and biohacking worlds, which is urolithin A. That has like really big aging marker or compound that can help with a lot of aging markers. Then, when you move into like nuts and seeds, I think, obviously in moderation, I think walnuts are like a magical nut, and really, really interesting science about walnuts outside of even just microbiome, but another great example of, really, really good fibers. And then of course, like, omega-3 is very important for your gut. So, I'm a fan of the smaller, if you're going to eat omega-3, I think, and if you are open to eating fish, sardines and anchovies are amazing resources, as well as salmon, although you have to be very mindful of just where that's sourced. But omega-3s are a really important compound for the gut as well. The gut is where like a lot of the inflammation is regulated. And so a lot of your immune system lives there. And so there's obviously a lot of compounds and omega-3 is one of them that can be incredibly useful. Again, nothing mind-blowing and new, because people I think already understand omega-3, but it's important to now think about it as not just serving your human parts, but also serving your microbiome. And then I think, after that, it's, after you think about the plant sources and the food sources, I think fermented foods are another good example where I think some people, because in the US, you can label them probiotics, there's a lot of confusion. They're not necessarily probiotics as much as the byproducts from the lactic acid fermentation that makes them is beneficial for us. So for example, in kombucha, when you ferment, your fermented tea have polyphenols in it. Right. So I was saying that compound being so important. So kombucha is fermented with mostly strains that are optimized for lactic acid fermentation. They weren't optimized for helping your gut barrier necessarily, but they do produce fermentative products, especially the kombuchas that aren't maybe laden with like a lot of sugar, that are helpful to health. Or kimchi, for example, is both deeply fibrous, but then you're also getting the fermentative byproducts that can be really, really helpful, as well as some of those fibers of cabbage, et cetera, can be very useful for feeding your microbes. And then it comes, you can talk maybe a little bit about like supplementation. So probiotics, of course, our world is like, a mass confusion on the internet of what is a probiotic, what is a prebiotic, what's a postbiotic. How do I even know which one to take?
And it just exploded in the last handful of years.
It really has. I think gut mania is a very real thing that we, of course, deal with on a daily basis. And always in like health, like you have these big explosions and then everything kind of normalizes a lot. But I think particularly with probiotics, I mean, obviously that's why one of the reasons we started Seed was to create a new standard in this field. And it was to really take this like therapeutic biopharma approach to create a new standard in probiotics. And that means rigorous science, frontier breakthrough research, rigorous clinical studies that you would do similarly that you would do for going through a drug trials. And then of course, really all for the ultimate goal of creating something that's extraordinarily effective and impactful for someone's health.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening today, of course, is that many probiotics, and again, in this country, it's also even further confusing because in other countries, you can't put probiotic on tortilla chips and chocolate bars. And, I think I saw on Amazon probiotic pillowcases and probiotic cleaning. You can't do that in other places, but in the US, the term's not regulated. So it really is the Wild West, even outside of supplements, because everything just says probiotic on it. Chocolate, mostly. The chocolate one is most amusing to me. So really, I think there's an opportunity in probiotics, like to impact your health on a daily basis. And that has to come down to what are the specific strains. First of all, what is the benefit you're looking for? Probiotics is like saying I take probiotics is saying like I read books.
Mm-hmm.
There's thousands and thousands of strains of bacteria. So each one mechanistically in the body does something different.
Mm-hmm.
And so you first need to say, why am I taking it? Some people say for general digestive health. In the future, we're going to say, I'm taking this probiotic for bone density.
Mm-hmm.
In the future, we're going to say, I'm taking this probiotic to ameliorate the effects of chemotherapy. Every and of course, when we start putting them on our skin, it's going to be to dampen inflammation and increase my, function of my skin barrier. So it really depends like what microbe you're using and for what. For DSO1, which is our adult product, we formulated that. It has 24 different strains of probiotics. It's the most like genomically diverse, which is a fancy way of saying that the way it was constructed was to be able to have an impact on the largest heterogeneous population. So also constructed to say like we wanted to look at benefits both in the gut, so digestive benefits, like there are strains that we work with that increase motility. So literally just like going to the bathroom, which a lot of the US and Western world still has trouble with because of diet and fiber gap. Looking at ease of like bloating and ease of digestion. So like a lot of people eat and the minute they eat, they just feel uncomfortable. And of course, bloating comes from fermentative activity, right? Gas activity. So there's microbes that can help with that. We wanted to look also in the gut at gut barrier function. So we know that just like living in the built world, we are exposed to so many aspects of our environment that rip up our gut barrier and really we've heard of leaky gut, but also create a lot of permeability. We published a paper on rinse-aid in like commercial rinse-aid. So just drinking water in a restaurant that's using rinse-aid in those like high heat dishwashers induces gut permeability at very low doses. And so, we really wanted to look at the gut barrier and we wanted to look at strains that help strengthen the tight junctions in your gut barrier because we know that like, you're just going to keep, not like you can't put yourself in a bubble. So you know that whether or not you're living a very healthy life, you're still coming in contact with the environment. And then we looked beyond the gut. We said, what are the strains that can also work on the gut-skin axis? So we have strains that dampen kind of some of the inflammatory responses that happen that lead to some of these flare-ups on the skin and other conditions. And we have like really interesting research, like even in cardiovascular health. So looking at strains that work on what's called on the gut-liver axis, that strains that microbes that work to kind of prevent the reuptake of circulating cholesterol in the body is another example. So it really with probiotics depends, like different strains do different things, and then they need to be included in the dosages that they were studied in clinical research. And then you need to figure out how you get them where they're supposed to go, which is primarily to the colon. So there's a lot of nuance in probiotics. For us, we have like our own delivery technology. We have a lot of data to demonstrate that we are able to get our microbes to the colon. So probiotics are, as I said, a little bit of a misnomer, but I think for anyone who wants to make it actionable, you need to be first starting from what is your desired benefit, and then working backwards to find products that are using the correct strains and the correct studies or dosages, and ideally who have done clinical research to know that it works in humans. Second is prebiotics, which is we kind of talked about with food, right? But then there's ways of also taking prebiotics, sometimes in supplementation, sometimes there's kind of like fiber supplements, and there's different ways that prebiotics can be consumed because they're not live microbes. Like a probiotic is a live organism that has to also stay alive. That's the other piece of probiotics that's really important. And you need to be able to demonstrate that not only it is alive, but it's also like a viable cell that can do something. And that's a whole, as you know from just the wine industry, right? Like fermentation's an art.
Yeah.
Like there's a whole art of like, and where art and science to fermenting and then scaling up like these microbes and then delivering them into the human body, which is like a whole other, aspect of it. And obviously that's a lot of why we started Seed on the technical side, which was to really have expertise there. I think for prebiotics, as I said, you can buy them in supplementation form or in get them through diet. I think people who are on FODMAP diets or who have like a lot of problems with like gas and bloating, they have to find types of prebiotics that are non-fermenting. The one in our product is non-fermenting. So if you're somebody who has some of that discomfort from fermentative activity or on a FODMAP diet, it's tolerable for you. Some prebiotics can be, especially in bigger doses, which is how people usually take them, a little discomforting. But again, even through diet, through plant, like very, very important. And then like the other lifestyle factors are not anything you would think are, from like everything from like stress impacts your microbiome. I think there's this cool study about just being in a crowded elevator. They saw someone's microbiome like shift. Like there's some kind of cool studies they've done on stress, sleep. Your microbiome actually has its own circadian rhythm, which is like really, really interesting. And so how you sleep is, again, nothing that you haven't heard from somebody telling you what's generally good for health. Exercise is really important for the microbiome. And then of course there's like, even just how to be mindful, I think, especially when you travel, I think that has a lot to do with like the food piece. I think a lot of times when we travel, our whole food intake changes. And I think just being very mindful of like, again, diversity of plants and the plant fibers and things that can just kind of bring you back to kind of stasis and regularity is very important. And as I said, in supplementation, a lot of people who use DSO1 tell us, they're like, when I used to travel, my digestion got all screwed up. And like when I use DSO1, like I feel actually it kind of stays regulated, which is cool. So there are strains that are obviously studied to be able to kind of maintain that that regularity, which I think is also really important.
If you're traveling, how do you travel with it if it's meant to be refrigerated?
Ours is not refrigerated.
Oh, that's right.
We're like fully stable, and that has to do with our delivery system.
That's amazing. Okay, so now shift into down south and for women into our vaginal microbiome and what you've learned about it, why, and why you're now dabbling into this area.
Yes. Oh yeah, I think we're much further than dabbling at this, at this
point. You're deep into
we're 6 years in, although our lead scientist, Dr. Jacques Ravel, is 20 years in.
Oh wow.
He's the foundational scientist of the field. He got the first NIH grant for understanding vaginal microbiome. Fun fact for anyone who needs yet another reason to understand why women's health has been so systemically deprioritized. When he first put in his grant, it was first rejected because they said that women wouldn't know how to swab themselves.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. Which is so interesting because there's been so much data showing how clinician swabbing and self-swabbing is actually like, there's been no difference. And he even had that data to prepare and they still rejected it at first, which was interesting.
Well, they don't want women swabbing themselves.
Yeah. I think, but it really, had he not persisted, really could have set the field back. So vaginal microbiome, just to define it, is, and really interesting and important to first make the distinction just coming off of gut, is the Human Microbiome Project, which was like $173 million project initiated under the Obama administration, set out to answer the question, like, what is a healthy gut? And I think they thought they would probably find that there's this like one gut that's like the like gut of all guts. And then all you have to do is think about how to like shape people's guts into that gut. That is what they learned, is that that doesn't exist and it will never exist. What they did learn are that there are some markers of health with the gut microbiome, and a couple of those markers, and probably most importantly to understand then the vaginal microbiome, is diversity. So if you think about it, like very obvious, look at a rainforest that's just been burned down and it's very sparse. It doesn't look as healthy. You look at a lush, beautiful, thriving rainforest with all different kinds of plants and animals, and it feels like a healthy ecology. That's how the gut should look, and that's really what was one of the core conclusions. And all of the things that I just talked about are interventions and lifestyle factors that contribute to diversity of a health, and then ultimately a healthier gut, and a healthy functioning gut. In the vagina, you want the opposite. So the vaginal microbiome is the same thing that I described earlier, which is it is the collection of microbes, again, mostly bacteria, that exist in the vagina and evolve there to do many, many, many things that have implications, and is really the key driver for urogenital, gynecological, reproductive health. It is probably one of the most important discoveries that will impact and change the trajectory of women's health forever. Very similar to the gut microbiome. What we understand about the vagina, and from Dr. Ravel's research, is that it is the exact opposite of the gut. You do not want diversity in the vagina. You want one primary defender most people and most clinicians will tell you you want lactobacillus. Yes, that's true, but it's not specific enough. What we know from Dr. Ravel's work over 2 decades is that you not only want lactobacillus, you want lactobacillus crispatus, which is very important because a lactobacillus crispatus dominant vaginal microbiome is what's called a CST1, which is a community state type 1. There are 5 different types, and now science is even kind of creating lots of different subtypes. But for the sake of simplicity, there's about five community state types that science has kind of articulated, characterize almost any vaginal microbiome on the planet today, including developed world and developing world. CST1 that is unlike the Human Microbiome Project when they were trying to answer for the gut, is the holy grail. And it is a vagina that is dominated by lactobacillus crispatus. It is the highest correlation with the best reproductive outcomes. It has the lowest vulnerability. It is the most stable. It is the most resilient. It is the most protective against everything from like STIs to, reproductive, implications like preterm birth to things like HPV and development of cervical cancer, UTIs, and being even an environment that would even be hospitable to E. coli, BV, et cetera, as well as many other pelvic inflammatory disease. I mean, you name it. Like the CST1 is the vaginal type that is the most correlated with health and the least susceptible to many of the conditions that so many millions and millions and millions of women suffer with. And not only suffer with, they then even after treatment suffer with recurrence. So BV, just take one example, is like 20 million women today, as we sit here, have BV. They'll go get treatment. 69% of those women will have recurrence within 6 months.
That's crazy.
We don't have answers to these things. Clinicians are as hopeless in many areas as the people who are sitting on Reddit at 2 a.m. searching for answers.
Right.
So, the vaginal microbiome, the gut microbiome, of course, there's so many areas. I mean, that is wide reaching and we're just scratching the surface. And obviously there's so many conditions where the solutions will come from that research. Women's health and vaginal microbiome is very different to me personally, because, we're in a moment where our bodies are being more regulated. We have so many few options, like 4% of biopharma research went into women's health, like some ridiculous number. We weren't even included in clinical trials until 1993. And so we're just in a moment where science sometimes is the extraordinary opportunity of activism. Like it's for us, I'm like, vaginal microbiome, knowing what we now know about the vaginal microbiome and its correlation with like everything from just helping women on their reproductive journey to make IVF more successful to what it's going to look like in terms of just clearing HPV and being able to, and it's beautiful because it really is this like foundational paradigm shift in how we think about our vaginas are things to be treated right now, kind of what we were talking about earlier. Yeah. And the vaginal microbiome offers us very similar to like sustainable agriculture, right? It offers us the opportunity to say, well, what is you can talk about foods not being nutrient dense enough, but you have to look at the soil. And I think what the vaginal microbiome says, we can look at the soil, right? We can look foundationally at the environment. We can modify that environment. And that's preventive, right? That's sustainable, long-term, but more than that, that's agency and control and bodily autonomy and areas like that and aspects of intervention that are also not so harmful to us and so also disruptive. Like sometimes the treatment's worse than the thing itself, right?
Oh yeah.
And then more than anything, what it also offers is an opportunity, very similar to what we were talking about with antibiotics earlier with the gut. When you take broad spectrum antibiotics, you wipe out everything. So what happens is it's very similar. It's like if you burn a forest and you never replanted it with what you wanted to see come back, you can't be surprised when the weeds grow. And it's very similar in the vaginal microbiome. Most of the treatments, whether it's boric acid or it's a broad spectrum antibiotic or a really harsh medication, they're scorched earth. Now, that's really for so many indications that it actually is the only answer that we unfortunately have today. That being said, there's an opportunity to now say, well, how can we now put the good stuff back? And how can we then let's till the soil, let's plant the seeds so that a year from now, there are no weeds, there's no pathogens, there's no bugs eating our food. It's like, and so there's a beautiful framework shift that the vaginal microbiome offers us. It's also really interesting because the more you understand it, you can also make decisions as a woman. Like, so many women, for example, I know are like, oh, like every time I have sex, like half my brain's enjoying it and half my brain's like, I'm definitely getting a UTI tomorrow. And so, it's awesome because when you start, the reason that we launched the product that we did, which is with Dr. Ravel, where we identified 3 of the most protective lactobacillus strains, again, going back to the beginning, when now you can look at their genomes, you can understand that even within Lactobacillus crispatus, there's hundreds of strains. So we looked at 600 and we found the 3 that are the most stable, the most resilient, and the most protective. And we launched the first symbiotic that's been clinically validated to shift any vaginal microbiome, and within 21 days, which was very cool in the study. And you know a little bit about clinical research from your work, which is, we had a 90% success rate, which just does not happen. I mean, even in the best clinical research, just as you don't see. And it shifted everyone's vaginal microbiome in the study to a Lactobacillus crispatus dominant vaginal microbiome. And that's a big deal because that means that that talk about empowerment.
And to me, this is the ultimate, the word that just keeps coming to my head. This is the ultimate form of empowerment.
Yes, it really is. And I think we're really excited about it. I think it was the first example for us where it was like, here's an area of breakthrough science that wasn't being translated, that wasn't being properly funded to realize its impact, where we were able to work with Dr. Ravel over the last number of years to really say, okay, we can take the science and actually turn it into something that can help millions and millions of women. And it doesn't have to go through 10 years of drug trials to do so, even though the rigor of what we do is, of course, is there. The other unfortunate part that you learn when you work in women's health is of what the safety standards are and what things are actually tested for, which is another bleak realization, which is many of these products that were being sold for vaginal health are not tested in the way they need to be. Yeah. So we actually developed new tissue models. We worked with different ways of being able to understand the impact of our product on the epithelial layer of the vagina. So really not just great science, but also then looking at making sure that we were creating kind of a new standard of safety in the product as well, which is of course incredibly important for me as a woman putting something out in the world for women's health. But it really is, it's the first time this has been done. And I hope that it's, of course, the beginning of many people, figuring out how to translate this field. But these strains and the product that we put out, which is a vaginal suppository tablet that you start in a 1-month reset. So it's a little bit more intense. It's 6 tablets across the first month that you start after your last period. Or if you're not menstruating, you can start at any time. And then every month after that, it's kind of like planting the garden and watering it. It's that 6-month reset. 6-tablet reset in the first month. And then after that, it's just 2 tablets a month on day 1 and 14.
Wow.
Yeah. Which is really exciting. Sometimes it doesn't I don't fully until when you hear women talking about using it and you're like, oh, this is bigger. I knew it was a big deal, but when I talk about it now out loud, you realize how exciting it is.
Because for so many women, it's chronic. It's like you said, half your brain is definitely. I mean, I know when I'm going to get a UTI.
Yes.
And it's like you're thinking, oh, I wonder what's going to happen to me if between 2 and 12 hours.
Yes.
And you just know, which is kind of incredible in itself, And then.
Yeah, but it's also really disruptive to quality of life.
Yeah, it is. And yes, it is. And so many women are just chronically dealing with vaginal issues. And I mean, we could go into 3 hours of a discussion on how they're poo-pooed and how they're told, just do this or whatever that is completely unhelpful. And no one has sort of broken it down and broken down the science even more importantly. And it is really frustrating because it goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning of the conversation, which is your first, the first thing you'll do is say, for a lot of women, not all of them, because a lot of women don't even have a gynecologist or have ever been to one, but I'm going to call my gynecologist. Yeah. And the first thing your gynecologist will do is prescribe you an antibiotic.
Yes. And
then you're good and, you think about it the next time. And just that line of, what if they said to you, we'll prescribe an antibiotic because you're at the point where you need it. But how did this happen? And why did it happen? And let's get back to that. That's just never a conversation, which is
To be fair to clinicians, the tools to do that weren't there.
No, they're not taught that way. They're not. That's just absolutely
there
not.
really wasn't. Even if they were taught that way, until we launched this product, for example, like there truly wasn't really much for them to do. Also, doctors don't. Most doctors are not nutritionally minded. So in the instance of like taking antibiotics and in the gut, many of them are not then also giving like dietary advice for like ways of replacing some of that or reconstituting some of the diversity of the gut. And so I think, but that will change. I think microbiome's a really interesting field. If you think about like genetics or you think about other fields of science that have been like extraordinary breakthroughs during our lifetime, they don't have a lot of consumer awareness, right? Because like there's nothing you can really do about it. Yeah. So, you take genomic tests when you're going through your reproductive journey, or you'll take a genetic test to be like, do I have the BRCA2 gene? But you don't, as I said, you don't go to Whole Foods for it.
Right.
And so I think the microbiome is so fascinating to me because the level of consumer awareness, they may not even know the word microbiome, but they might just say like gut health, for example, or just the awareness of things like probiotics is so fascinating to me because it's a field of science that is early, has an extraordinary velocity to it, has some very meaningful knowns that can really shape the way we live. But it's like consumer awareness of it is like much higher than really any field of frontier science has ever been. And that's a fascinating Venn diagram if you think about, of course, the opportunity for us, right? Because there's the educational opportunity, not just for earthlings, but also for clinicians, right? Because science is too new. So for many clinicians, it wouldn't have hit them, nor is it well integrated yet in medical school anyway. So really beautiful opportunity for us to also be able to, educate clinicians, to your point, so that we do imagine a future where if you're going, and that is happening. So what happens today is someone prescribes antibiotics and they say, oh, just pick up like whatever probiotics at CVS when you get there or whatever. Yeah. And that's kind of what the pharmacists are doing today. I think that we look forward to the future where they're recommending the probiotics that actually have science to do the things that they're articulating. And I think that's like a future we're very excited about.
Yeah. That's life-changing for a lot of people. Yes. I think I have been so in tune to the idea of gut health and microbiome and probiotics. Yeah. One of my kids has really interesting gastro, all the things. I had him talk to a friend of mine who went through a very similar stage when she was his age. So kind of like late teens, early 20s. And then helped him understand, or tried to help him understand, he's still really young, that it's not just about flare-up deal, that there's reasons and then the reasons behind what happens, and let's address those, And one of the biggest things you brought up a few times just in passing earlier was travel. And not just this sort of time change, which really messes with, a lot of your body and internal organs, but it brings a level of stress. It just does. And stress can mean so many different things. It's the lack of sleep. It's the, I'm in a new place, all these things. And that triggers different things in different people.
Absolutely.
And just trying to understand that. And if there are things you can do to help lower that level of stress or anxiety, or just what's going on internally, either through a probiotic or also lifestyle, and what can you continue to eat while you're, on the road, whatever it is. I mean, those are actionable items that give people a lot of agency. And I think at the end of the day, that's, in my opinion, like one of the more really important parts of this piece, which is, and particularly for women, it's, well, what can I do now? And now like you said, like maybe a while, clinicians couldn't do anything, but now they can.
Yes.
So the other piece is, how do we, and this isn't a question to answer right now, but this is like, to me, a big question. How do we then educate that community, And I've talked about this for 25 years, is in terms of women and their preventive health. It's not just listening to your doctor, but it's that entire medical community listening to us.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a big obstacle. One, getting women in particular to speak up in those situations, and then also to have them listen, because that's the only way to move forward.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many things to address in there. I'm particularly excited about how AI will change the voice in the room.
Yeah.
So to speak.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
Literally and figuratively. I think you have to find the love language of people. And I think one of the areas, the love languages of the clinical community is data and good data and reliable data and credible data. I think that when you start to articulate these things at scale and you have like the data to demonstrate the results from them, that's
it's
where
undeniable.
You know, it's undeniable. With nutrition and certain lifestyle factors, some of those studies or nutrition studies are notoriously very challenging to design and to trust and to have at the right scale that a clinician, for example, might buy in. So that's something that we think a lot about, which is what data is necessary to convince. And of course, for us, it's like first table stakes is you have to be doing double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trials, and you have to be publishing not in some like random nutrition journal that no one's ever heard of. You need to be publishing in vaginal microbiome, for example, the top obstetric journals. If you're going to do like our pediatric symbiotic was published in Nature.
Yeah.
You know, which for anyone listening is kind of like Vogue in science. You know, and so you have to be doing great, you know, you have to be doing great science. So I think that's part of it, which is more people doing better science, which of course is making sure that gets funded and, you know, that's happening, which can happen through many different mechanisms, as you know. I think there's also, like, to your point about the agency piece, I think it also, one of the beautiful things, I kind of have a book I've always wanted to write, which is like kind of it's called How to Raise a Superorganism, which is like nurturing your child's microbiome from birth, which is, you know, the things that you're talking about. And it's beautiful that your son has that exposure to somebody who's also been through it.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, the microbiome, as I said, kind of teaches you also to be really attuned to a whole other part of you, right? Which is very spiritual, very, very in line with what mindfulness and many of the more spiritual frameworks that I think we're like adopting at scale more. I had someone tell me that when they meditate now, they think about their microbiome because of seed. But it is also a beautiful attunement to say, you know, sometimes it's not like we kind of think always in like system, in ways of like, again, reacting like, oh, well, if just tell me what pill I should take if I get on a plane. And I'm kind of like, well, if you understand that these disruptions persist for you, look at your plane time. Right? Like, don't fly, don't take red eyes. Like, you know, for certain people who are really prone to flare-ups and disruptions, like, don't take a red eye. Take the morning flight, eat well, get exercise before you go, you know. So I think there's also sometimes it's like, we don't want to sometimes just like really examine some of the things we have such control over, like what flight we take. And I think that there are really beautiful tools now. I mean, we work in probiotics, right? As an example, like for anyone, you know, we have so many people who have different conditions and flares. We hear anecdotally all the time that things we can't talk about because we can't make those claims. But like what DSO1 has done for hundreds of thousands of people is create that stasis, right? Because what we know, you said stressors, right? Define food is a stressor. Everything that you, from a biological perspective, everything you introduce into a system is actually technically a stressor. So like us sitting in this air conditioned room, that's a stressor. It's changing the temperature. Our body is sitting here trying to adapt,
figure it out
to this very, very cold room, to this air conditioning, because it's not the temperature that's out. And then I'm going to go outside and I'm going to be, temperature is a stressor, and I'll be dealing with sunlight, and I'll be so, you know, everything is a stressor. But for people who have to, they walk and like biologically on eggshells, right? Your son, you start to also become scared of things, right? You're like, oh, I don't want to eat that now. It interrupts quality of life. It takes up a lot of mind share to like navigate. And so the question that I always come back to is like, to your point, is like, you can also with knowing what you can know about the microbiome, you can like find the ways to create stasis for yourself that I think we just didn't have the tools for before. And I think you, in those moments of acute flare-ups, there are also things you can do. You know, and or if you have to do something that you know might have like then like an antibiotic, a different problem introduces another problem. Then there's also something you can do to kind of assuage. And so I think it's a beautiful idea to like raise children thinking a lot more in like systems and like stasis and saying, look, you're going to experience stressors throughout your whole life. What do we want to do as parents? You want to raise resilient children. Their biology is no different, no exception. Like you want, you know, and it's not disconnected either, right? Like the way that our kids experience stress is a huge part of whether or not they develop many disorders in the future. And there's lots of research around this. And we know that even the microbiome responds to psychological stress and trauma and other things. So I think a lot of it is like, it's a bit about very similar to parenting. And for all of us, really, it's like just teaching resilience.
Yeah.
And the microbiome is just kind of this other tool in the toolkit that can become such a catalyst for resilience.
Yeah.
Because like, I'll give you a great example with the vaginal microbiome. Menstruation and sex are the two biggest perturbations. Either you can stop menstruating and decide to do that in whether you're entering perimenopause or menopause, or just actually stop getting your period. You can do that through contraception. Or you can understand that, like, if I know that I'm going to experience disruptions from like sex, that includes like oral sex, fingers, everything, like even, or like a lot of BV is transmitted through oral sex as an example. The question is not like, am I going to stop living my life like for your son, but what are the baseline things I can do so that when those stressors happen, I can come back to a place that like I have resilience to come back to stasis.
Exactly.
Right. And I think that's really, and it's a really beautiful framework that the world, I wish, worked more on for both medicine, parenting, how we think about food, right? I think we've really gotten like the psychology of food wrong in a lot of ways, and so I think there's like microbiome has a lot of lessons, life and society lessons in it too. But overall, it's it's an amazing lever we have to create like a kind of resilience so that we can go live out, we can travel. Yeah. If we do take that red eye, we have tools and ways of thinking of making sure that like underneath it all, we're more resilient.
Yeah. Just the word red eye is like so
It is.
Well, I mean, what I've been saying forever is, for 25 years, is to women in particular, it's know your normal, right? Yeah. And I think it's the same message. It's know where your stasis is. Yes. And that changes. That changes throughout your whole life. And there's life changes that make it change, before babies, after babies, perimenopause. I'm in the throes of it now. My normal, my stasis is so different.
Yes.
But it's understanding that and finding ways to always try to get back to that.
Yes.
I think that's an incredibly important takeaway. I really feel passionately about that. Yep. And I think that as women who lost our moms when we were young and watching them go through such a horrible journey, I think one of the things that I think we share as well is, there's only so much we can do, right? But I think if you arm yourself with the tools and the education to figure out what you can do to not just stay healthy, but I guess stay in that level of stasis, then I think it's so empowering. Like, to me, that's the definition of empowering ourselves. And you can't live a life out of fear, but you can live a life of empowerment and figuring out how, like, that word stasis is like, going to be my new word. It's so important. And, when you talk about the gut and the gut-brain connection and the gut-liver connection, everything, it makes sense because it's like the center of our bodies. But as you said, it's everywhere. And so it's not breaking us down into just this central zone, but it's thinking from head to toe. And it's so powerful what you've done. And I think lots of people can build companies and lots of people can make products that are helpful and that are worthwhile. I think for me, listening to you a few times now and like the whole journey of your life is clearly shown in this company. And it's so fantastic and beautiful. The name couldn't be more fitting. It really is. And I think we should all be more in tune with your voice, because I think it's really powerful.
Thank you. So I really appreciate
thank
saying
you.
That. Thank you.
No, I think it's it's like a buzzword right now, probiotics and microbiome, but I think the essence of it is it's just so huge and significant.
And I think what you said, I really love the know your normal. And I think what's beautiful about embracing the microbiome is as a lens, maybe through which we see our world and our health and our children.
Yeah.
You said something beautiful, which is like always trying to get to stasis. And I think that the trying to get to, that is where there's a lot of stress and a lot of suffering. I think that science is a beautiful discipline because it's a discipline of inquiry.
Yeah.
And I think it's a very spiritual practice, which is you have a group of people who have an idea about the world. They create an experiment, they run that experiment, and they observe and they learn, and then they iterate.
Yeah.
And I think we talk a lot at Seed about living scientifically.
Yeah.
Which is, you have to have non-attachment to the most important thing in science is like non-attachment to the outcome, right? You need to be doing it for the purpose of inquiry.
Exactly.
And
or you'll affect the outcome.
You can run your life as a series of experiments. You think you know this as a parent, like God knows the thing you did 2 weeks ago doesn't always work 2 weeks from now.
Right.
You know, and that's because so many variables change. And so I think if you also can find stasis and accept the ever-changingness.
Yeah.
You know, bacteria are one of their greatest assets.
Yeah.
Is that they can adapt very quickly. Sometimes they can create adaptations in as little as minutes.
Yeah.
To a changing environment. And I think one of the things, and as I said, going back to resilience, is even stasis. Sometimes I feel like people say trying to find stasis, and what that does, very similar to what we've done with women with the idea of beauty. Or like weight or bodies, or even now I think health even in itself is kind of a new form of Photoshop, right? Is it creates this idea that there's an end state that you're going to one day reach. And you're going to suffer a lot on the way to figuring out how to get there. And that like one day you're just going to be there. And I think what it really forgets in doing, and I think that creates a lot of suffering because you're really attached to this like outcome of like what you think health looks like. What do you think it feels like? And I think there's a lot of freedom and empowerment that comes from like freeing yourself. And we say health is a verb. So it's actually just something you do every day. You do health. Like that's how we talk about it. And that kind of also says very similar to knowing you're normal, but you can also embrace the idea that your normal is going to shift.
Yeah.
And so you really actually have to get okay with stasis, meaning some aspect of varying environmental changes, factors. And so stasis can also really become this like, even like all these other things are happening. I think you have to assume that like, it's not this like thing that's going to happen one day at the end of the time graph, right? You're going to all of a sudden like have this like, you know, epiphany or moment of enlightenment, but that actually enlightenment can happen on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And you can do that through experimentation. You're like, I'm going to try this diet for 1 month. I'm going to see, I think there's a lot of good reasons why I should try it. But if you're saying to yourself, like, this is the thing that's going to get me there, it just creates a lot of suffering. And most importantly, I think it actually goes against what we know about stressors and the microbiome and the fact that all these variables are always changing. And so I also like encourage a definition of stasis that like allows for this like way of living that like you want to be like finding the resilience through that, not that you're doing all of these things today for like this thing that's going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
You know, which is like, I think for women especially, like very important because we really suffer. We put ourselves through a lot of suffering for an end goal that truthfully the goalposts just kind of keep moving.
Yeah, I agree. Well, amen. That's like, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Ara.
So
this was phenomenal. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so happy to see you again.
Me too. It was awesome. Thank you.